Bookmark. The flight attendant's voice rose above the hum of the engines, loud and commanding. This is the last time I'm asking. Move to the back of the plane, or I'll call security. Her words carried a sharp authority, her tone thick with disdain. Amara Davis, a poised and self-assured black woman, raised her eyes to meet the flight attendant's glare. Her voice was calm, deliberate, and steady as she replied, "I've already told you I'm not moving." There was no anger in her tone, just a quiet strength that couldn't be ignored. Though humiliated by the spectacle, Amara sat unwavering, her dignity intact. What no one expected was that this woman, whom they assumed was powerless, would soon reveal exactly who she was. The jet shimmered in the afternoon sunlight, a marvel of modern luxury. Its sleek exterior promised an extravagant journey, while the cabin inside was a world of indulgence. Plush leather seats, gold accents, and an atmosphere of exclusivity that made every passenger feel like royalty. Travelers moved effortlessly through the space, dragging designer luggage behind them as they approached the private jet on the tarmac. Soon, they began to settle into their seats. Some passengers scrolled through their smartphones, while others sipped glasses of champagne offered by the attentive crew. Gentle ambient music played softly in the background, completing the serene atmosphere. Among them was Amara Davis. In her late 30s, she radiated elegance and composure, dressed in a perfectly tailored burgundy blazer and matching trousers. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her every movement exuding grace. Amara wasn't one to seek attention, yet her presence was impossible to ignore. Stepping into the cabin, she paused for a moment, her eyes briefly scanning the space. Her steps were unhurried, her demeanor calm and measured. To everyone else, this seemed like an ordinary flight. But for Amara, this was no casual trip. It was a journey to oversee her rapidly growing empire. What none of the other passengers realized, however, was exactly how powerful this woman truly was. At the entrance of the cabin stood Claire Morgan, the head flight attendant. In her early 40s, Claire carried herself with precision and poise. Her navy blue uniform was impeccably pressed, and her blonde hair was styled into a flawless bun. With sharp, discerning eyes, Claire made it her mission to maintain order on every flight she managed. Claire greeted each passenger in turn, her smiles varying in warmth. For some, she offered an overly cheerful welcome. For others, her demeanor turned cold, her judgment swift and unapologetic. She prided herself on maintaining control, though that control often depended on her personal biases. When Amara reached the entrance, Claire's smile faltered. She offered a curt and clipped greeting, "Welcome aboard," with a tone so lacking in warmth it was almost dismissive. Amara didn't react, her calm demeanor unshaken. Behind Amara sat an older couple, the Fosters. Mr. and Mrs. Foster, in their 60s, carried themselves with the ease of frequent travelers. Mrs. Foster clutched a small knitting bag, her fingers already itching to begin her craft, while Mr. Foster leafed through a newspaper with mild curiosity. Claire's demeanor shifted completely as she greeted them. Her tone brightened considerably as she said, "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Foster. It's always a pleasure to have you with us." Amara, who had just taken her seat, glanced over her shoulder. She noticed the stark contrast in how Claire treated her, compared to the couple. Her expression remained calm, but her eyes reflected a sharp awareness of the underlying dynamics at play. As the other passengers settled in, Claire moved through the cabin, ensuring everything was in perfect order. She stopped by the Fosters, offering them a warm smile. "Can I get you anything before we take off?" she asked. Mrs. Foster shook her head politely, already focused on her knitting, while Mr. Foster nodded toward his coffee, signaling he was satisfied. When Claire passed by Amara, her demeanor shifted again. Her eyes lingered on Amara's neatly stored handbag, her lips pressing into a thin line. She made no effort to extend the same courtesy, choosing instead to walk past without a word. Claire Morgan's entire persona revolved around control and appearances. To her, appearances mattered more than anything else, and her judgments were swift. Amara's presence unsettled Claire in ways she didn't fully understand. It wasn't Amara's calm confidence or her understated elegance that irritated Claire. It was the fact that Amara didn't demand attention like the passengers Claire deemed worthy. In Claire's mind, Amara didn't fit into the exclusive world she tried to cultivate on her flights. Claire approached Amara with quick, purposeful strides. Her lips curved into a tight, almost forced smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," Claire began, her tone polite on the surface but laced with condescension. "I believe you're in the wrong section." Amara looked up, her gaze steady but calm. "I believe this is my seat," she replied, her voice even and composed. Claire's smile didn't falter, but her tone grew sharper. "I don't think so. This section is reserved for our elite passengers." The tension between the two women was palpable, and the cabin grew quiet as nearby passengers began to take notice. What happened next would change everything. "This section is reserved for our premium passengers," Claire said, her voice loud enough to draw attention. Nearby, passengers began to shift in their seats, their curiosity piqued. A nosy socialite with flawlessly styled hair leaned forward, her eyes sparkling with intrigue as she tried to catch the drama unfolding. Across the aisle, an affable businessman in a neatly pressed gray suit furrowed his brow, clearly uncomfortable with Claire's tone. Amara Davis, however, remained unshaken. Her gaze remained steady as she responded calmly, "You might want to double-check your passenger list before making assumptions." Claire's irritation deepened, her eyebrows arching sharply. "I don't need to check anything," she shot back, her voice hardening. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." The tension in the cabin thickened like a storm cloud. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Some whispered among themselves, their words barely audible over the low hum of the plane's engines. "Why doesn't she just move if she's in the wrong seat?" one passenger murmured. "She's probably trying to snag a free upgrade," another shrugged, clearly dismissive. Claire folded her arms, her stance rigid as she planted herself firmly in the aisle. Her voice rang out again, this time louder. "If you don't move to the back of the plane right now, I'll have to call security." Amara tilted her head slightly, her expression serene but resolute. "Call whoever you need to," she said softly, "but I'm not moving." The nosy socialite gasped softly at Amara's quiet defiance. The businessman leaned forward even more, his frown deepening as the situation escalated. Claire, now visibly flustered, turned toward her junior colleague, Mia, who stood nervously near the galley. "Mia," Claire snapped, "escort her to the back of the plane, now." Mia hesitated, her eyes darting between Amara and Claire. She glanced at the passenger list clipped near the cockpit door, unsure whether Amara's calm suggestion to check it might actually hold merit. But Claire's sharp glare froze her in place. Reluctantly, Mia nodded and stepped forward. Amara shifted slightly in her seat, her calm demeanor unbroken. She looked at Mia and said softly, "You might want to think carefully about what you're about to do." Her words carried a quiet power that made Mia pause mid-step, but Claire waved her off with a dismissive scoff. "I know exactly what I'm doing," Claire snapped. "Now get up." The tension in the cabin crackled like static electricity. Passengers sat frozen, their gazes darting between the two women at the center of the confrontation. Amara leaned back in her seat, her voice steady and calm as she said, "You shouldn't make assumptions about people." Claire's smirk widened, her tone mocking as she replied, "And you shouldn't be sitting in a seat you didn't pay for." As the confrontation hung in the air, Amara reached for her phone with quiet determination. Her calm expression didn't waver as she typed something quickly. Setting the phone back down on the armrest, she met Claire's glare with unflinching composure. "You're making a mistake," Amara said simply. Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Claire scoffed again, brushing off the warning. "We'll see about that," she muttered, motioning for Mia to act. The junior flight attendant's hesitation grew more palpable. Her hands trembled as she glanced again at the passenger list, clearly torn between following Claire's orders and doing what she instinctively knew was right. Before Mia could act, Claire barked at her. "Mia, what are you doing?" Mia flinched at Claire's sharp tone. "I was just checking the list," she whispered, barely audible. "I've got this under control," Claire snapped, her voice filled with icy authority. "You don't need to get involved." Defeated, Mia stepped back, her face flushed with embarrassment. Meanwhile, the businessman across the aisle leaned forward again. His kind eyes met Amara's as he asked gently, "Is everything all right?" Amara offered him a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice steady but grateful for the brief moment of support. Before the businessman could say anything more, Claire cut him off, her tone sharp. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage this disturbance," she said, her words clipped and patronizing. She turned back to Amara, pointing a finger at her. "You're causing a scene," Claire accused, her voice rising. The businessman frowned, his voice calm but firm as he replied, "From where I'm sitting, it seems like you're the one causing a scene." Claire's face flushed with anger. Her authority was slipping, and she knew it. Amara didn't flinch, her calm demeanor only fueling Claire's frustration. The flight attendant's voice rose again, echoing through the cabin. "This is your last chance. Move, or I will personally have you removed from this plane." Amara met Claire's fiery gaze with unwavering calm. Her voice, soft but firm, cut through the growing tension like a knife. "You're going to regret this," she said simply. Passengers exchanged glances, whispering among themselves as they watched the scene unfold. The socialite leaned toward her seatmate, whispering loudly enough for others to hear, "Looks like she's trying to sneak her way into first class." Claire seized on the comment, her smirk returning. "That's exactly what it looks like," she declared, her voice smug as she turned to the other passengers as if rallying their support. "We have rules for a reason, and some people just don't respect them." Amara remained silent, her quiet defiance speaking volumes. Unbeknownst to Claire, however, the tides were beginning to shift. Some passengers frowned at her behavior, while others sat uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of how to react. And through it all, Amara's calm, composed presence was slowly unraveling Claire's carefully maintained control. Mia, the junior flight attendant, stood at the back of the cabin, her lip caught between her teeth as she wrestled with her conscience. She wanted to intervene, but the fear of losing her job held her in place. Across the aisle, a kind-looking man leaned forward. He was a businessman, dressed in a crisp navy suit with an air of calm authority. He smiled gently at Amara Davis, who sat composed amidst the growing tension. "Excuse me," he said softly. "Is everything all right?" Amara turned to him, her steady expression softening just slightly. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her voice calm but tinged with gratitude for the small act of kindness. Before the businessman could offer more support, Claire cut in, her voice sharp and accusing. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disturbance," she said curtly, turning her attention back to Amara. Pointing a finger directly at her, Claire added, "You're the one causing a scene." The businessman frowned, unshaken by Claire's tone. "From where I'm sitting," he said calmly, "you're the one making a scene." Claire's face turned red with anger as she glared at the man, but she quickly redirected her frustration toward Amara. "I've had enough of this," she snapped. "Either you move, or I'll make sure you're escorted off this plane." Amara met Claire's fiery gaze without flinching. Her voice was steady, yet resolute. "You can try." Claire's frustration boiled over. Her voice trembled slightly as she leaned closer, her words laced with contempt. "Why don't you just admit you're in the wrong seat and stop wasting everyone's time?" Amara remained silent, her calm demeanor unshaken. Her composure only seemed to inflame Claire's anger further. Unable to get the response she wanted, Claire finally turned and stormed down the aisle, muttering under her breath. As Claire moved briskly through the cabin, her polished heels clicked sharply on the carpet. In her hands, she carried a tray of sparkling water, her professional demeanor intact, but her irritation simmered just beneath the surface. Amara, meanwhile, remained seated, her attention returning to the book in her hands. The cabin had settled into a quiet buzz, with passengers chatting softly, though their eyes occasionally darted toward Amara. Claire's hostility resurfaced in subtle ways. She made no effort to acknowledge Amara as she served other passengers, her tray nearly empty by the time she reached Amara's section. Finally, Amara spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. "Excuse me, could I have some water, please?" Claire paused, her eyes flicking toward Amara, her lips curled into a thin, dismissive smile. "I'll get to you when I can," she said curtly, brushing past without another word. Amara's calm gaze followed Claire's retreating figure. She remained silent, her composure unbroken. Minutes passed and Amara shifted slightly in her seat, adjusting her position to get comfortable. Her legs stretched slightly into the aisle, a subtle movement that was neither dramatic nor disruptive. Claire returned with the tray in hand, her sharp eyes catching the adjustment immediately. Rather than ask Amara to move her leg, Claire chose to change her path deliberately. In one swift moment, Claire's foot struck Amara's leg. The tray wobbled, and the glasses of water tumbled forward, splashing onto Amara's lap and the floor. Claire gasped theatrically, her voice rising as she exclaimed, "Watch where you're putting your legs. You've caused a mess." Passengers turned their heads, startled by the commotion. Amara looked up, startled but composed. Her hands calmly brushed at the water on her trousers as she replied evenly, "But you walked into my leg." The businessman frowned from his seat, clearly unimpressed by Claire's overreaction. Amara tilted her head slightly, her voice unwavering as she added, "I've only asked to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. And if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here." Her words hung in the air like a quiet but powerful rebuke. Claire's face flushed with anger. She stepped closer, her frustration boiling over as she hissed, "You think you can talk to me like that?" Then, in a shocking moment that left the entire cabin in stunned silence, Claire raised her hand and slapped Amara across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin, sharp and startling as a clap of thunder. Gasps rippled through the passengers. The businessman rose halfway from his seat, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. Mia's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Even the nosy socialite, who had been enjoying the drama, appeared taken aback, her smirk replaced with unease. Amara slowly straightened in her seat, her hand resting calmly on her lap. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes carried a weight that made Claire hesitate for the first time. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Amara said quietly, her voice calm but cutting through the tension like a knife. Passengers watched, their breaths held, as Amara looked up at Claire. Her voice was steady and composed as she continued, "I've been patient with you, but your behavior has crossed the line." Amara Davis sat composed, her words deliberate and firm as she addressed Claire. "You'll regret that." Her calm voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the entire cabin. Claire's jaw tightened, her hands curling into fists as she shot back. "Cross the line? You're the one who's been disruptive since you got on this plane." Amara didn't flinch. She didn't touch her face or rise to the provocation. Instead, she straightened her posture, her unwavering gaze fixed on Claire. "I've been patient with you," Amara said softly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "But your behavior has gone too far." For the first time, Claire faltered. Amara's composure, her unyielding strength, shook Claire's confidence. But the flight attendant quickly recovered, masking her unease with a scoff. "Regret it?" Claire sneered. "What are you going to do? Call the police?" Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than words, and the passengers could feel the balance of power shifting in her favor. Mia, the junior flight attendant, stood at the edge of the scene, watching with growing unease. She had seen Claire's behavior escalate throughout the flight, and her discomfort had been building with every passing moment. Now, as Amara's quiet strength clashed with Claire's fury, Mia knew she couldn't stay silent any longer. Discreetly, Mia stepped away from the commotion. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed a number. When the call connected, her voice was hushed but resolute. "This is Mia. We have a situation on board." Returning to her post, Mia's expression was a mix of determination and worry. Meanwhile, Claire stood with her arms crossed, her anger still simmering but her authority visibly slipping. Amara, seated with quiet confidence, remained a stark contrast to Claire's mounting frustration. The passengers, sensing the tension, exchanged nervous glances. One woman, seated nearby, leaned toward Amara and whispered, her voice low but filled with concern, "Are you okay?" Amara turned to her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "I'm fine," she said softly, her composure unshaken despite the hostility she had endured. The cabin was silent, save for the faint hum of the plane's engines. The passengers waited, unsure of what would happen next. Amara sat steady in her seat, her clothing still damp from the spilled water, as her calm gaze shifted back to Claire. "All you had to do," Amara said, her voice calm but firm, "was treat me with respect. But you couldn't. Because of your prejudice, you assumed I didn't belong here." Claire's irritation deepened. Her grip on the tray tightened as she leaned closer to Amara. Her tone turned mocking as she hissed, "Respect? Maybe you should earn it first. People like you don't deserve my respect." The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, the unspoken tension palpable. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The businessman who had supported Amara earlier now glared openly at Claire, his arms crossed in silent judgment. Amara's expression didn't change, but her tone sharpened. "You shouldn't have said that." Claire folded her arms, her anger still simmering but her confidence slipping. She scoffed dismissively. "Oh, please. I've been more than patient with you. Maybe now you'll understand that actions have consequences." Amara's gaze narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor still intact. "You're right," she said, her voice deliberate. "Actions do have consequences, and you're about to find out just how true that is." For a fleeting moment, Claire hesitated. Something in Amara's tone sent a chill down her spine, but she quickly pushed the feeling aside, feigning confidence as she waved dismissively. "I'm not afraid of your empty threats," she said. "You're the one who's going to regret this, not me." Claire turned away, trying to convince herself she had won. But deep inside, unease began to creep in. She knew she had crossed a line, though she refused to admit it aloud. As she glanced around the cabin, Claire noticed the shift in the passengers' attitudes. The businessman glared at her with open disapproval. The nosy socialite, who had eagerly watched the drama unfold, now shook her head disapprovingly as she whispered to her companion. And Mia, clutching the passenger list with trembling hands, looked like she wanted to disappear. Amara, meanwhile, remained seated, her calm and composed presence radiating strength. Claire's mind raced, replaying the confrontation in her head. The way Amara carried herself, her steady voice, her quiet authority, it didn't align with Claire's assumptions. For the first time, a sliver of doubt pierced through Claire's anger. "What if this woman isn't who I think she is?" Claire thought, her stomach twisting. Her confidence wavered further as she recalled Amara's words. "You're making a mistake." The realization hit her like a wave. Claire had let her prejudice cloud her judgment, and now she could feel the weight of her actions closing in. Amara's expression was calm but unreadable as she crossed her legs and leaned back in her seat, radiating a quiet confidence. Her composure was unnerving, and Claire felt her unease grow with each passing second. Amara didn't need to raise her voice or act out. Her silence spoke volumes, saying everything Claire didn't want to hear. The tension in the cabin was suffocating as Claire tried to regain control of the situation. But no matter what she said or did, she couldn't shake the nagging feeling that her actions would come back to haunt her. Amara's words echoed in her mind. "You're making a mistake." What Claire didn't know was that Amara's calm response to the slap wasn't a sign of submission. It was part of her strategy. Trouble was brewing, and Claire was about to discover just how serious her mistake had been. Claire paced back and forth near Amara's seat, her frustration bubbling over. Passengers whispered among themselves, casting curious glances at the two women. Amara remained calm and composed, as though the events around her didn't affect her at all. Yet Claire couldn't ignore the growing pressure. It was like the walls were closing in, and deep down, she knew she had crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Without a word, Amara reached for her phone. Her movements were deliberate as she typed a message quickly and set the device down on the armrest beside her. The action seemed simple, but it carried a weight that made Claire glance nervously at the phone. "What do you think you're doing?" Claire asked, her voice sharp. Amara didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her composure unwavering. "You'll find out soon enough," she said softly, her words sending a chill down Claire's spine. The cabin fell into an uneasy silence, broken only by the low hum of the plane's engines. Passengers exchanged anxious glances, whispering to one another. The nosy socialite, who had been watching the drama unfold with wide eyes, leaned toward her companion and murmured, "What's going on? Do you think she's someone important?" Across the aisle, the businessman tapped his fingers against the armrest, his gaze fixed on Amara. A knowing look crossed his face, as though he had pieced together something the others hadn't. Then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. All heads turned as the cockpit door opened and the pilot stepped out. His face was pale, his expression tense. The pilot scanned the room briefly before walking directly toward Claire, his movements purposeful and deliberate. "What's going on?" Claire demanded, her tone sharp. Her irritation was evident as she crossed her arms. The pilot stopped in front of her, his posture rigid. "You need to step aside," he said, his voice firm but laced with discomfort. Claire frowned, her confusion growing. "Excuse me?" she said, her tone defensive. "Why would I need to step aside? I'm handling this." The pilot's gaze flicked to Amara, then back to Claire. He hesitated for a moment, then said plainly, "I just received a call from management. The owner of the plane is on board, and it's Miss Davis." He gestured toward Amara. The pilot's words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers gasped in shock, and a ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin. The nosy socialite audibly inhaled, her eyes wide with disbelief. She turned to her companion, her voice tinged with awe as she whispered, "She owns the plane?" The businessman nodded knowingly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I had a feeling," he muttered under his breath, as though the revelation confirmed what he had suspected all along. Mia, standing near the galley, froze in place. Relief washed over her face as the truth sank in. Amara wasn't just another passenger. She was someone far more powerful than anyone had realized. Claire, meanwhile, stared at the pilot, her face turning a deep shade of red. Her usual sharpness faded, replaced by a stammering disbelief. That can't be true," she said weakly. "There must be some mistake." The tension in the cabin was almost tangible. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their minds replaying the slap and the way Claire had spoken to Amara. Amara, however, remained seated, her posture as poised as ever. Then, without warning, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be making an unscheduled landing. Please remain seated and prepare for descent." Confusion rippled through the passengers. The businessman leaned toward Amara and asked quietly, "What's happening? Why are we landing?" Amara didn't answer. Her serene expression didn't falter as she gazed out the window, her thoughts unreadable. The plane touched down smoothly on the runway. Moments later, a sleek black SUV pulled up directly to the tarmac, its engine idling as two sharply dressed assistants stepped out. Their movements were brisk and purposeful as they approached the plane, their presence commanding attention. Claire stood frozen in the aisle, her confidence completely shaken. She watched as the assistants climbed the steps and entered the cabin, their gazes immediately locking onto Amara. One of them spoke with warm respect. "Miss Davis, everything is ready for your review." The cabin erupted into more murmurs as the passengers pieced together what was happening. Claire's face drained of color. She stammered, her voice barely audible. This must be some kind of mistake." But it wasn't a mistake. And now, Claire would have to face the consequences of her actions. The doors of the sleek black SUV swung open, and two impeccably dressed assistants stepped out. Their movements were brisk and purposeful as they ascended the plane steps with an air of quiet authority. The moment they entered the cabin, one of them spoke warmly, their tone respectful. "Miss Davis, everything is ready for your review." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Claire froze in place, her face draining of color as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. "Miss Davis?" she stammered, her voice barely audible. The assistants ignored her completely, their focus entirely on Amara. One of them turned to her, asking with quiet deference, "Do you need anything before we proceed?" Amara stood slowly, her movements graceful and deliberate. She adjusted her blazer, exuding a calm confidence that radiated power. The passengers watched in stunned silence as Amara finally spoke, her voice steady and commanding. "I'm Amara Davis," she began, her gaze sweeping across the cabin. "I'm the owner of this plane, and I'm also the owner of this airline." Claire's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The confident, condescending flight attendant was now a pale shadow of herself, her earlier bravado replaced with sheer panic. Amara turned her attention to Claire, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Claire, your behavior today has been nothing short of disgraceful," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "You've humiliated yourself, mistreated a passenger, and tarnished the reputation of this airline." Claire's hands trembled as she stammered, I didn't know." Amara raised a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to treat me with the respect that every passenger deserves," she said firmly. "Instead, you made assumptions, acted with prejudice, and escalated a situation that could have been handled with basic decency." The passengers, who had been watching in silence, began to nod in agreement. Their earlier hesitation gave way to murmurs of support. The businessman across the aisle folded his newspaper neatly and gave Amara an approving nod, while the nosy socialite sat frozen, her expression a mix of awe and disbelief. Amara took a step closer to Claire, her movements deliberate and her voice steady. "There's no mistake in your actions, Claire," she said, her tone quiet yet filled with authority that silenced the entire cabin. Claire's eyes darted around the room, searching desperately for support, but no one came to her defense. Some passengers discreetly raised their phones, recording the moment. Amara continued, "While you were busy judging me," she began, "you failed to do your job. Your job is to treat every passenger with respect, no matter who they are or what you assume about them. And now there are consequences." Claire's hands clenched at her sides, her mind racing. She wanted to argue, to defend herself, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of the passenger's judgment pressed down on her, and for the first time her confidence crumbled completely. Amara turned to the pilot, her expression calm but commanding. "I want this addressed immediately," she said firmly. "And I want to ensure that this doesn't happen again, to anyone." The pilot nodded, his demeanor professional. "Understood, Miss Davis," he said. Claire took a step back, her mind swirling with panic. Her instincts screamed at her to leave before things got worse. But as she turned toward the exit, the pilot stepped into her path, his expression firm. "You're not going anywhere," he said. Amara's gaze didn't waver as she addressed Claire directly. "Your actions today have proven that you are unfit for this position. Effective immediately, you are fired." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Claire's face crumpled and she took another step back, her confidence completely shattered. "Please, Miss Davis," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean." Amara's expression hardened, her voice cold. "You didn't mean to get caught," she said. "But you did. And now you'll face the consequences." At that moment, 2 uniformed police officers boarded the plane, their presence causing a wave of murmurs among the passengers. Claire's face turned ashen as the officers approached. One of them spoke respectfully to Amara. "Miss Davis, we received your report. Are you pressing charges?" Amara's gaze didn't falter. "Yes," she said firmly. "This individual assaulted me in front of multiple witnesses. I expect her to be held accountable." Claire gasped, taking a step back, her voice desperate as she cried out, "Wait, this is a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to." The officer stepped forward, producing a pair of handcuffs. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for assault," he said. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Claire's breathing quickened as the reality of her situation set in. Her gaze flicked to Amara, who stood calm and composed, her presence a stark contrast to Claire's unraveling demeanor. Trouble had arrived, and Claire finally realized there was no escape. Claire's hands were cuffed behind her back as the police officers led her down the aisle. Passengers watched in stunned silence, the once dominant flight attendant now a defeated figure. Tears streamed down Claire's face as she pleaded desperately. "Please, Miss Davis, I'm sorry," she sobbed. Amara's expression remained calm, her voice quiet but resolute as she replied, "Your apology means nothing without accountability. You made your choices, and now you'll face the consequences." All eyes remained fixed on Claire as she disappeared from view, her arrogance replaced by humiliation and regret. Amara turned back to the cabin, her voice steady as she addressed the passengers. "To everyone here, I want to apologize for what you had to witness today. This is not the standard of service I expect on my planes. Moving forward, I will ensure that every passenger is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The cabin erupted into applause, a wave of relief and admiration washing over the passengers. The businessman gave a small cheer, while the nosy socialite, who had spent much of the ordeal wide-eyed and fascinated, clapped enthusiastically. Mrs. Foster, who had quietly set aside her knitting, joined in with a polite but approving nod. Amara turned toward Mia, the junior flight attendant who had quietly supported her throughout the ordeal. Her tone softened as she said, "Mia, I noticed your professionalism today. Thank you for stepping up when it mattered. You'll be hearing from my office about a promotion." Mia's eyes widened in surprise, her face lighting up with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Davis," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Amara offered a brief smile before stepping toward the exit, her assistant following closely behind. The plane's atmosphere had shifted completely. The earlier tension was replaced by admiration and a sense of relief. Passengers smiled at one another, the warmth of the moment spreading through the cabin. The nosy socialite leaned forward in her seat, blurting out, "Miss Davis, you're amazing." Her admiration shone brightly in her wide eyes. Amara turned to her, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "Thank you," she replied warmly. "Remember this moment. It's always worth standing up for what's right." As Amara stepped off the plane, the fresh air of the tarmac greeted her. The sleek black SUV waited patiently, its driver holding the door open. Her assistants walked beside her, briefing her on the next meeting, but her thoughts lingered on the events of the day. Later, in a televised interview, Amara sat in a sleek studio, her poised demeanor captivating the interviewer. Leaning forward, the interviewer asked, "Miss Davis, your story has gone viral. Millions of people have seen how you handled the situation. What message do you want to send?" Amara's gaze was steady, her voice clear and resolute as she answered, "Respect is a right, not a privilege. Everyone deserves dignity, no matter how they look, where they come from, or what others assume about them. True leadership is about setting that standard and ensuring it's upheld." The interviewer nodded, visibly moved. "And what would you say to those who face similar challenges but don't have the platform you do?" Amara's expression softened, her voice carrying quiet strength. "I'd say that strength comes from within. Even when you feel invisible, remember your worth. You don't need a title or wealth to demand respect. You just need to stand firm in who you are." A few weeks later, Amara boarded another flight. This time, the energy was completely different. Warm, welcoming, and professional. The lead flight attendant greeted her with a genuine smile. "Welcome aboard, Miss Davis. It's an honor to have you." Amara returned the smile as she settled into her seat. The atmosphere felt lighter, the service impeccable. But more importantly, it was filled with the respect that every passenger deserved. As the plane sped down the runway and lifted into the sky, Amara gazed out the window, watching the world below blur into a patchwork of colors. A sense of peace washed over her. The events of that day had left a lasting impact, not just on the passengers and crew who had witnessed them, but on everyone who had heard the story. Amara knew her actions had turned an injustice into a powerful lesson, one that would ripple far beyond that single flight. She smiled softly, knowing that sometimes the most powerful victories weren't about winning, but about inspiring change. As the jet climbed higher into the clouds, Amara settled into her seat. In the aftermath of everything, she realized this wasn't just about her. It was about changing a system that allowed prejudice and assumptions to thrive. And she was ready to lead the way. Amara sat by the window, the breathtaking view of the horizon stretching endlessly before her. The world below faded into a sea of blue and white, the gentle hum of the plane's engines providing a soothing backdrop. She gazed out at the boundless sky, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. A quiet sense of peace washed over her. This wasn't just about confronting prejudice or asserting her authority. It was about transforming a moment of humiliation into a powerful lesson, one that would ripple far beyond a single flight. Amara smiled softly to herself, the weight of the day giving way to a quiet triumph. She knew this was only the beginning. With every decision, every new policy, and every act of leadership, she was shaping a future where respect and kindness were the standard, not the exception. The plane soared higher, cutting through the clouds as it moved toward its destination. Amara, seated at the helm of her vision, felt a triumph so steady, no turbulence could shake it. Shortly after the flight, Amara released a public statement that resonated far beyond the confines of the jet. In a heartfelt video that quickly went viral, she spoke directly to the world. "Luxury isn't about appearances. It's about the experience we create for everyone. True success isn't measured by what you can afford, but by how you treat others. This is why I'm implementing new policies across my airline to ensure that every passenger, no matter who they are, feels valued and respected." Her message sparked a wave of conversations across social media. People applauded her leadership and her commitment to change. Hashtags like "respect above all" and Amara's vision trended for days, inspiring millions to reflect on their own behavior and biases. Amara's story became a beacon for others, a reminder that strength comes not from power or position, but from standing up for what is right. As the jet climbed higher into the clouds, Amara leaned back in her seat, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. This was more than just a victory for her. It was a call to action for change, a movement to build a world where dignity and respect weren't luxuries but rights afforded to all. With her airline as a platform, Amara was determined to lead by example. And as the horizon stretched endlessly before her, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next.